some protests on the street got kind of violent, so they burned part of the street down. So if you're here watching this video, you're probably very aware of the political and the economic crisis that Sri Lanka is going through right now. I was actually in Sri Lanka for the last 3 months, 11 and a half weeks, and I was there before the protests started and before things got really bad. And I was there through most of it, and throughout this time I was traveling as much as I could around the countries to the popular tourist destinations and making videos, because that's kind of what I do for a living, make videos for this channel. And I heard a lot of concerns every time I would post anything about Sri Lanka, and I noticed that a lot of people have misconceptions about how these protests are playing out, because all you see is what you see on the news, which only focuses on the sensational negative stuff, and they don't always tell you the full story. So I just want to talk a bit more about this. So if you are a tourist who is planning to go to Sri Lanka anytime soon and is concerned, or if you're just a foreigner who's concerned about what all of this looks like from a foreigner's perspective in Sri Lanka, this is the video for you. So before we get started, I want to give you a little bit of background on this situation so you can understand what's happening better and the things that are happening right now. So Sri Lanka is in a political crisis right now, but all of this basically started from an economic crisis, which led to Sri Lanka being basically bankrupt. So a lot of things went into creating this economic crisis right now. First of all, Sri Lanka has recently at least been a country that's very dependent on tourism. And then in 2019 there were the Easter Sunday bombings, the terrorist attacks, where like a lot of people were killed and a lot of foreigners were killed. And right after that, in 2020, there was COVID. So because of the sort of strict restrictions on tourists coming in, the tourism sector was like starving for 2-3 years straight, and that was a big part of their economy, and that really affected the country's ability to get foreign income or to get foreign revenue into the country. And on top of that, there was a lot of arguably mismanagement by the government, and this is where it gets really interesting. A couple of years ago, around the same time, right before COVID started, the government introduced these tax cuts that were meant to stimulate the economy, but that kind of backfired because that meant the government was getting just less money from the people. And the government also tried these new agricultural policies, which spectacularly backfired and caused them to lose like a lot of money. So all of these things combined basically led to Sri Lanka running out of its, or almost running out of its foreign currency reserves. They also started taking out loans from other countries that they were not able to pay back, loans from China, which made the situation even worse and brought them even closer to bankruptcy. So it eventually came to the point where Sri Lanka had all these debts to foreign countries and did not have the foreign currency reserves to pay them. So this meant they couldn't buy like very essential stuff from abroad because they didn't have the money to buy it. They didn't have the money to buy fuel, which is probably one of the most important things. They didn't have the money to buy very essential medical supplies. And this lack of foreign currency also led to this inflation that the country had never seen before in all these decades since independence. And it led to like the basic commodities getting more expensive without people's salaries getting any better. And this was partially because the Sri Lankan currency was devaluing at the same time compared to all other more stable currencies like the dollars, the euros. This crisis was caused partially again due to things that no one could have done anything about. Like no one could have predicted COVID. That was bound to take a hit on tourism. But the local people also started pointing fingers at the government, accusing the government of mismanaging the economy. So this is where this interesting person comes in, the story. Gota, who's the president of Sri Lanka. This guy is actually a background in the military and was like a very crucial figure in the Sri Lankan civil war that ended like a decade ago. He was elected president like 2.5 years ago. And then after getting elected, he appointed one of his brothers as the prime minister. He appointed another one of his brothers as the finance ministers, and a bunch of other male figures from his family ended up being ministers on his cabinet. So obviously when there was like all this economic mismanagement, people were like not happy. Like your finance minister is supposed to be the most skilled person in your country who's capable of running the finances of the country, not your brother, which is what people were saying basically. So when things started getting really bad, people basically got down on the streets and started demanding Gota, the president, to resign. So Gota had other plans. He did not want to resign, and he brutally suppressed these protests, which led to even more protests popping up all throughout the country. So when I went to Sri Lanka, like in the middle of February, there were no protests. Now it's happening every other day, everywhere, in all the cities. And this is because pretty much everyone I've met from Sri Lanka is fed up with this government and wants it to go right now. They want changes, they want it to happen now, and the government doesn't want to go. Hence the political crisis right now. So let's come to the most important question that I get, and which you might have as well. How does all of this affect safety for tourists? Well, the good news is, for you at least, is that it really doesn't affect the safety of tourists. No matter who it is in Sri Lanka, be it the protesters or be it the government or be it the police, they sort of all know that one of the big reasons that this whole crisis is happening is because tourists stopped coming to Sri Lanka because of COVID and for other reasons, and no one wants tourists to stop coming again. So they're doing everything in their power to make sure all of this is not affecting the tourists. Tourists have extra privileges that even the local people don't have. Just to provide you an example of how much different or safer it is for tourists compared to the locals, when the protests erupted for the first time in a grand way, the government announced this curfew for I think 48 hours. So none of the locals could go out and join the protests. At the same time, every establishment that was meant for tourists was open and running. Every restaurant in South Sri Lanka that tourists usually go to was open. Every bar was open. There was this shady club in Midigama in South Sri Lanka called Chiki Monkey, which is apparently run by the mafia. They had this rave in the middle of all this, so people were out there and dancing to electronic music in the middle of all of this. So it's crazy how different the experience was for locals as opposed to tourists who barely felt a difference throughout the protests. It's starting to rain all of a sudden, but the point I was trying to get across is that it's super safe in Sri Lanka as a tourist, at least just as safe as it used to be before the protest. Let's talk about other ways in which all of this might affect you other than safety. A lot of people are often concerned about the inflation and how that's affected me. I had people in the comments ask me if I can still afford food and stuff. So yes, inflation is happening, but I don't think it's happening as fast as the currency is devaluing. So prices of basic foods and stuff have gone up by maybe 20, 30, 50% in some places, but the price of the dollar has gone up by 75% since I went to Sri Lanka 3 months ago. So if your money is in a stable currency that's not Sri Lankan rupees, things are probably cheaper now than they used to be. The hostels that I was staying in April, that I was also staying in February, were a lot cheaper when I was paying in dollars. Now a lot of places have figured this out and they're starting to charge people in dollars now, in which case the inflation won't be affecting you at all if you go to a venue like that. So now let's talk about some of the bad sides to actually traveling to Sri Lanka right now. The biggest thing is because of these protests, it's often hard to get from one place to the other, especially if you're going between cities, because a lot of these protests happen on the streets between big cities, so that might cause the roads to be blocked, that might cause the buses not to run. There's one time I was going from Mirissa to Hikkaduwa in the south, and on the way back we saw that protesters and cops were sort of going at each other, and they burned a segment of the street. So we had to go around that street, go behind this railway track to get around, so it was a 30-minute longer way than we would have usually had to go. But because of these roadblocks, because of strikes, sometimes it's just hard to get placed from one to the other. So I was trying to go from Adams Peak to Kandy, another city in Sri Lanka, 2 weeks ago, and then this one day all the unions for trains and buses and everything was on strike, and we were almost stuck in this village by Adams Peak. So me and my friend eventually had to get a long distance tuk-tuk to go from there to Kandy, which cost I think 20 times what a train ride would have cost. So these are things you have to keep in mind. Things might be a lot more inconvenient and you have to be flexible with your routine. When I was going to the airport on my last day, in normal circumstances I would have just taken a train to Negombo to the airport on the last day. But because it was May 1st, because I thought there might be protests for Labor Day, I went a day early to Negombo, spend the night there to make sure I can catch my flight on time without having to worry about any delays due to protests on the streets. Now another huge downside of all of this economic crisis was the power cuts that was happening. So because the country ran out of fuel, and because the country also relies on hydropower, and this was a delayed monsoon season this year, the country stopped being able to produce as much electricity as was needed to provide the whole island with electricity. So when I went there in February, there were no power cuts at all. When I was there in late February, early March, the first power cuts started coming in. At first it was 1 hour, 2 hours a day. It was very manageable. You just go out and do something else when there was a power cut. But then this kept getting worse and worse and worse till there were 13-hour power cuts at the end of March, the start of April. I rely on electricity. I need my computer to edit these videos. I need Wi-Fi to upload them, and I just couldn't work. When there's no power for 12 hours, your laptop lasts 2, 3, maybe 4 hours tops, and then there's nothing you can do about it. I remember there was one day when we had a power cut from 2 p.m. till midnight. Then we were okay, finally we can go to bed, because this is South Sri Lanka where it feels like it's 35 degrees every day, even though it's 30 degrees because it's so freaking humid. And then at 3 a.m. there was another 3-hour power cut, and we all woke up in the middle of the night just sweating because we couldn't sleep in our beds without the fan. It was insane. So things have gotten a little better on this end. It did start raining after that in April, and this huge ship of fuel arrived from India, which made the situation a lot better. And when I left at the end of April, start of May, there were only 2, 3, 4 hours of power cuts a day, which is a lot better than 13 hours, but still not ideal. So this is something you definitely want to keep in mind, especially if you're a digital nomad and you need electricity, you need internet for your job. You don't want to get fired by showing up to Sri Lanka at a time when it doesn't have any power. So to summarize, safety is not really an issue, in my opinion. In the opinions of all of my friends who were there during this whole time, at least no more of an issue than it used to be before all the protests. But power cuts might be an issue, so this is something you want to consider if you need the internet, if you need electricity all the time when you're staying in Sri Lanka. You have to be more flexible. There might be delays in your travel dates because of protests that block the streets, but there are ways to get around it. On I guess the positive side, because of this currency devaluation, Sri Lanka is, I want to say, cheaper than it used to be 3 months ago. So if you're traveling through Asia and you need a place to go to that's not very expensive like Korea or Japan, Sri Lanka is a good place to be right now as a tourist. And finally, Sri Lanka is a good place to be because it is safe and they really need your foreign currency, your foreign dollars. The whole reason they're in this mess right now is because people stopped coming. So if people stop going because of all of this, they're just going to be in a shittier situation with their economy on the brink of collapse. That's my 2 cents on all of this. If I made any mistakes, especially about discussing the political situation or any details about that, feel free to correct me in the comments. If you like this video, feel free to hit the like button. If you want to see more videos like this, I'm probably not going to make a lot more videos like this. This is just something a lot of people are asking me about, so I wanted to clarify. If you know someone who might be benefited from watching this video, feel free to share this with them. That's it for this one. I'll catch you guys on a normal travel vlog, probably next time from Sri Lanka or from India.